Towards the end of the Into the Inklands metagame, you saw Emerald Steel really come out as a huge contender for one of the best decks in the format. And unfortunately, for those of you that aren't a big fan of this deck and its playstyle, with the introduction of Ursula's Return, this deck has had a huge paradigm shift in what it runs now in terms of its deck list, which again is linked in the description, compared to what it ran in Into the Inklands. But it's probably, at least right now at the start of the metagame, looking like it's the strongest deck of the format, because as you can see in this opening clip here, what this deck aims to do, it can do now more consistently, in that it's able to discard the opponent's hand, it's able to remove their board, it's able to remove their items even, and it's able to generate a ton of advantage. Here you can see I'm up, what is that, like 12 cards to one irrelevant item. And against a deck that, you know, historically might have given Emerald Steel some trouble in Amber Steel Song, even a top-decked Whole New World wouldn't do it for the opponent, because I could potentially draw 14 if I wanted to, since the Diablo was exerted, and if the opponent drew 7, I could draw an additional 7 as well. What I want to do in this video, though, is contrast what Emerald Steel did in the Into the Inklands format, comparing it to what it does now. And the deck list, like I said, is linked in the description, but the deck profile video will be separate, and I'll post that early for members, so if you want to support the channel and get early access to some content, you can always do that. But of course, it'll be made available to the public a little bit later on. In this video, though, we're going to go up second against Amethyst Steel, a matchup that Emerald Steel probably had some trouble with. Well, I know it had some trouble with it, depending, in the previous format with Into the Inklands, because the Amethyst Steel package could outdraw the Emerald Steel discard package. And to a certain extent, you know, if you don't get your engine rolling or get rid of the opponent's hand, as soon as they start dropping some of those bigger threats, like even this Jafar or Tinkerbells or Cinderellas or anything like that, it's just like you don't have enough to deal with their board, right? Steel can't out their board fast enough in order for them to just overwhelm you and win the game. The discard doesn't matter because they already have a developed board. And you know, this is where a deck like Emerald Steel really relied on certain combinations of cards, which made it inherently weaker, because you did rely on combos. You needed to see multiple cards at the same time in order for it to work well. And in this instance, I get the combo off where I'm able to leave my Ursula Deceiver on board on the field, right? It didn't get challenged, it didn't get outed by a song or something. I'm able to then play the Prince John and sing the Sudden Chill for an instant 4-card advantage swing. 2 discarded by my opponent, and then 2 cards drawn by me. The Daisy Duck questing there also forces another discard, leaving the opponent with 1 card in hand, and just like that, we have, well, after inking and playing this Merfolk, 4 cards in hand to the opponent's 2. A bigger board than theirs, but this is where the game can kind of get away from Emerald Steel in the old format, where they start dropping those big threats, whether it be on Steel, Ruby, whatever, and you just have a hard time outing it potentially with Emerald Steel. You had to really dominate the game early on and get ahead in the lore count, hence the aggro threats of Flynn Rider and Curse Merfolk, and some board control options with obviously the songs from Steel and the Captain Hooks and Mr. Smees. But when you look at what the deck does in Ursula's Return, you don't play the Captain Hooks, the Mr. Smees, the Prince John, the Daisy Duck, the Flynn Riders, both the 2-cost one, or if you're opting to play this one in my hand here, the 4-cost one either. The deck has really shifted in terms of what it wants to do. And thankfully, we were able to out that Tinkerbell, because that represented a huge problem for us, being able to just out our board, basically, right? Tinkerbell, if you can't quest through it, potentially represented a hard stop against Emerald Steel, because whatever you quest with, the Tinkerbell is going to start trading 2 for 1 when it crashes into something and then takes out another threat with the 2 damage it's able to ping. So despite all that advantage, you can see here, you know, the opponent still has 2 cards that represent card draw in the Rabbit and the Blue Fairy on field, and all it takes is for them to drop another big Flyborn character, in this case one of the better ones, again in the Tinkerbell, just wiping out my board, wiping out the Cursed Merfolk and dealing damage to the Beast to prevent the double draw. They can't deal with the Flynn Rider, and oddly enough, this tech option that really wasn't played all that much is what's going to win me the game, because otherwise I'd potentially lose this game if it wasn't for that Flynn Rider, right? Because what am I going to do? Quest with my Ursula and Beast and just get outed by the Tinkerbell and then lose my board again and not be able to quest for game, right? So you can see how the deck was a little fragile despite getting very powerful combos off. What you're seeing now in Ursula's Return is the deck have a way more resiliency with the introduction of this new Pegasus shift, as well as more consistent ways to get to their card draw. Now, the matches we're going to take a look at here are going to showcase some of these examples. Against Emerald Amethyst, this should be, I don't want to say an auto win for Emerald Steel, but it's a very favorable matchup for you, I would say. Despite being on the draw, you're going to be able to basically remove their threats faster than they can draw their answers. With the introduction of those 3-cost Floodborns, Diablo, and Aladdin, the introduction of Bucky back into this deck just makes your game plan of discarding the opponent's hand that much more efficient without having to necessarily play slower cards or like Daisy Duck and stuff like that have to wait to quest. And then the introduction of Diablo makes it so that you don't have to have a Prince John on the field and then a discard card, so like a combo, in order to get that discard and draw off. The Diablo is just going to straight up draw you cards. The Diablo is also going to act as counterplay against things like Rapunzel's and Hirams and Whole New Worlds, because if it's exerted and they draw off of those cards during the opponent's turn, you're drawing off of them as well. And so it really represents a strong shift in what this deck is able to do in terms of its consistency, because now you can draw cards off Beast Tragic Hero or Diablo. Again, not invincible cards by any means, but to have constant answers for both Diablo and Beast Tragic Hero is going to be a bit of a problem while you're still trying to combat the Bucky that hits the field that just sits there in ready state with ward, meaning you can't Sisu it, you can't brawl it, you can't let the Storm Rage on it. It's very difficult to deal with, and as a result, you're losing your hand and you have to combat the card draw that the opponent has going for them as well. It's not impossible to beat, but it makes it a little bit harder and makes this deck a lot more resilient for that reason. Now, I made a misplay here. If you saw my opening mulligan, I meant to put Backlit the Storm Rage on so that I could ink the Strength of the Raging Fire, but then my brain just like mixed the two up and I put back the Storm, or I put back the Strength and kept the Storm, so I rightfully got punished here. But my opponent on Emerald Amethyst here is going for a very aggro-esque version, and they have an interesting tech option going back to the original Elsa, which is an interesting tech card, I would say, because as we see more characters that just want to sit there in their readied state in order to get their abilities off, this Elsa in Amethyst does represent a tap down into a Mim Fox for a challenge. And I've talked about this in my Amethyst reviews, or just my general game review, where I said we need more ways to exert characters, because the game is just in a state where without that becoming more prevalent in the game, whoever's on the play just has way too much advantage, right? Because they develop their characters first and you just can't deal with them. So my opponent ends up scooping there because the draw into the double Pegasus represents a 14 lore swing, because I can quest for 7, my whole board is protected with evasive because of the Pegasus shift, and then I just quest again because the opponent on Emerald Amethyst has no way to out my threats unless they still play Mother Knows Best, and even then it's just a tempo loss for them, more or less, right? I have too much advantage already developed. So the opponent scoops there. Now in this matchup against Sapphire Ruby, this is one of the decks that I think definitely got a lot better with Ursula's return. Ice Block, Sisu, things that we reviewed in our card reviews are definitely making their way into these decks and showing to be very effective. But here you can see me opt not to play the Robin Hood because I know that Sapphire Ruby is a slower deck, and so I don't necessarily need to develop those early threats in the Robin Hoods, the Shift Robin Hood, whereas in every other matchup, that's a very valuable combination. Instead, I'm valuing the ink that those Robin Hoods represent and opt to go for the discard package of the Bucky and start playing those Floodborns. Now, you could argue that I should have sung the Sudden Chill, but because it's my only song in hand right now, I'm opting to keep it for the Ursula Deceiver of All. The opponent does have to waste their turn on the Brawl, which is interesting. I draw into a Robin Hood here, and again, a Shift Robin Hood in this situation doesn't really represent too much value like it does in other like aggro-focused matchups or mid-range matchups. In the control matchup, the Robin Hood is definitely a little more underwhelming. The Aladdin, though, on the other hand, being a 3-cost Floodborn, coming down, forcing the discard off Bucky, and now threatening my opponent's items, is huge in these matchups. So you can see here the opponent is going to ink Fishbone Quill, play a Fishbone Quill, so there's no Maui, because questing with my Bucky here could be seen as a misplay, but I did see them ink a Maui, so I figured, they're probably not valuing their Maui too much. They probably don't have another one. Fortunately, I do disconnect because there was a thunderstorm in my area, but I had pretty firm control of that match in my opinion, especially with the Aladdin on board. Being able to out the opponent's item, it didn't look like they had an answer directly to it. So between discarding their hand, taking out their items, and then the Steel Songs mopping up any lower strength characters they have, and or the Bruno spell being able to bounce back their big threats without any hand, forcing the discard, which I've talked about before, being a very powerful out to strong characters like Tamatoa. I think I had pretty good control of that match and probably would have won if it didn't disconnect there. In this next matchup, though, we're going up against another Sapphire deck in Sapphire Steel. And these Sapphire decks are definitely some that can give Emerald Steel trouble just because of the Hiram draw engine if they get that going. So you do have to be careful of that. But if you're very aggressive with the discard and with your own card draw engines, you should hopefully be able to keep pace with them. And then it's really just down to who has the better cards or who plays better in order to win the game. Because you're both drawing cards. If you're focusing on discarding while your opponent develops their board, your opponent in the Sapphire Steel player should be able to beat the Emerald Steel player. Now, this particular version was a hero-focused version, which is very interesting because we all think that Phil is a good card, but in practice, I just think it might be a little too slow. So here, I am expecting a Hiram to come down because I saw the opponent ink one earlier. There's no way you ink one unless you have another one here. So sure enough, they end up drawing two more. And what's nice about Sapphire Steel is like you have a good amount of access to decent heroes that you could play. And you still have, like I said, the Fortispheres and the Popsicles, like I mentioned in previous videos. But with this Ursula Deceiver of All, thankfully I'm able to get rid of the two challenging threats, which means my Ursula lives to sing another song, and my opponent probably doesn't put me on having another strength, so they probably think their Hiram is safe, not really going to be able to be challenged. So instead of developing an item for more card draw, they develop a very strong threat in the Cogsworth, which, like I've mentioned many times before against other steel decks, is basically a win condition in and of itself. Thankfully, though, we're able to put through 3 damage times 2 thanks to our third copy of Strength to out the Hiram, and that outs the opponent's card draw engine, at least for now. They still have this Cogsworth and they still have 3 cards in hand, but the Robin Hood coming down here forces the discard of a Phil, which is interesting. Now the opponent just has a Cogsworth and 3 cards left after inking that Popsicle. They drop an interesting card here in the Little John, which, you know, just amps up the resist factor on their cards, which is very interesting. The top decked Pegasus here, though, is just like insane because now my whole board is going to have evasive for the next turn, which means my opponent can't challenge it. They're going to need songs in order to remove my threats here. And this is why, again, if you watch my Sapphire Steel video, I talk about playing those Grab Your Swords now, because it would just, well, yeah, it would do decent work against this board. It wouldn't win them the game, or, you know, give them a tremendous advantage, but it would stop them from losing the game right now. Anyways, in the end, you can see here that it's just not enough for the opponent here. A lot of heroes on board, but nothing to deal with my board, and as a result, we end up taking that one rather comfortably. The last match I want to show you here is against Amber Steel's Song, because again, this is a match that you may have had some trouble with before, and while it can give you some trouble, maybe if you're on the draw and your opponent curves out like almost perfectly in terms of the Cinderella turn 1, let the Storm Rage on your threat on turn 2 or turn 3. If you go first, or if the opponent doesn't curve out perfectly, you have a lot more versatile options now in Emerald Steel, because again, in your 3 drop slot, instead of relying on a Prince John comboing, you can do Ursula Deceiver of All or Diablo, both in and of themselves very strong cards because you do play something like 17 songs in this deck, so you'll probably have something for Ursula Deceiver of All. Regardless, though, knowing that I'm going up against Amber Steel's Song here, we're playing Ursula Deceiver and we're ripping away one of those Let the Storm Rage On, and we see a bunch of uninkables in the opponent's hand, so we know they're probably going to ink that Mr. Smee. Sure enough, they do. They develop a Lantern here, and yeah, they're just sitting on a bunch of uninkables, which is what happens with Amber Steel's Song, right? You play like 20 plus uninkables, all low to the ground, so you know you shouldn't be bricked for too long. But top decking the second Ursula Deceiver, I immediately say, yeah, let me rip out the second Let the Storm Rage On, because I don't want them top decking into ink and then drawing into more cards that could potentially help unbrick their hand. So they're going to drop an Ursula, which is very interesting here, the Singer 4, Quest with Robin Hood, and Pass. I do have to be wary of a top deck Robin Hood shift because they do have the Lantern, so even if they don't have the ink to go to 3 ink, with the Lantern they could shift the Robin Hood, and that could represent a little bit of a problem. So here you're going to see me crash both of these Ursulas, and knowing that they have a Zeus in hand, I'm going to think about this Bucky, but then decide to try to bait out the Zeus by putting the Diablo on board. This will prevent their Ursula from crashing into one of mine, because they're going to want to sing Zeus with their Ursula to take out my Diablo. Just to, again, cause them to waste a song, and then I can potentially develop my Ursula Deceiver of All if I draw into a good song that I want to play next turn or the following turn, or just double up on the Diablo and Bucky depending on what I draw. So no inkable here, which kind of sucks, which means I have to ink this Ursula Deceiver in order to develop the Bucky and the Diablo, which is going to force the discard of that last lantern that I saw the opponent had on the second Ursula Deceiver. I quest with both Ursulas and pass turn. If they want to challenge one of those Ursulas, it's totally fine. They're going to end up inking Cinderella and using both lanterns in order to hard cast the Robin Hood. So they indeed eventually draw the Robin Hood. So taking out the small one was probably good because it keeps the opponent's board underdeveloped. Since they can't develop that Cinderella, they have to ink it in order to hard cast the Robin Hood here. We do have the Diablo exerted now, which means we're going to get that card draw engine rolling. Only a Grab Your Swords here would really get the opponent back into the game. Again, a Whole New World would probably see me draw 14 cards, which you could argue is bad for me because I could potentially deck out into if the opponent draws into more Whole New World. But again, at this point, the opponent is in a really rough spot. We draw Grab Your Swords here, and while the opponent is on no cards and they're on very little ink, they still have a Robin Hood and some decent threats on board. They have a Singer that can do some work. They've got the other bigger Ursula that'll discard cards. But in this setup, I'm going to opt to ink the Sudden Chill, since obviously the opponent has no cards. Hardcast the Grab Your Swords after crashing into their Ursula Singer to take it out. And off of their draw 1, my double Diablo is going to draw 2. Now, unfortunately, when they quest with their Ursula, they're going to be able to discard that Baboom. That's totally fine because I do have my Robin Hood Shift that's going to be able to develop onto my smaller Robin Hood and take out that Ursula, which represents, again, me keeping up with the lore count because I'm going to gain 2 lore off of this, and then quest for 2 with the Diablos, which is going to represent a draw 2. So you can just see how insanely powerful this setup is. I don't really know. Like I said, Grab Your Swords is really the only thing I think the opponent can draw. Okay, that helps the aerial to dig for the Grab Your Swords, and sure enough, they do indeed find it. And what looked like a really, really strong position for me, look at that. All my advantage is gone, right? The opponent now has an aerial Singer and a Robin Hood with double lantern, despite only being on 3 ink, and I only have 5 cards in hand and no more developed board, losing both of my Diablos here. But again, like I mentioned in my videos, that We Don't Talk About Bruno song represents removal for Emerald because the opponent has no hand. I've discarded it with the, well, I don't know if I discarded it completely, but, we forced them out. Well, yeah, we discarded a good amount of cards. And with no cards in hand, that Along Came Bruno is a bounce and remove of whatever it is that I want to out on the opponent's field. In this case, it was the Robin Hood, since they were forced to discard it after I bounced it back to their hand. I shift Pegasus here and take out the aerial, thinking that the opponent drew into an uninkable song, not being a Whole New World because they would sing that with their aerial if they had it, but I out the aerial there to prevent them drawing into a Whole New World and getting back into this game. And what's funny is, okay, so they top deck that song, they hard cast the Zeus on my Pegasus to prevent me from continuing to quest with that evasive threat, and I draw a Sudden Chill, which I'm going to force them to discard. So the turn after I out the aerial, they draw into the Whole New World. So talk about luck on my end there, or making the right call, trying to play around the different threats that are available here. They top deck a Benja, and I think they realize the game is over. They're feeling kind of down and out, my guess is, and so the Benja here just ends up outing their own item and my Strength of the Raging Fire and Let the Storm Rage On, which is not something you'd normally do. That's a really bad play, but I didn't really care because, again, I pretty much felt that I had the game in the bag at this point, so we're just out their threat. They draw and pass, and oh man, we drop the Aladdin, which again is going to represent removal of that lantern and just further domination of anything the opponent attempts to develop, whether it be in their hand, on their field, their items, whatever it might be. Yeah, this deck just showing why it's so strong. So that's going to wrap it up. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, and make sure you are subscribed and you liked the video if you did enjoy it, and you want to see more. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.